Hello everyone, welcome to PureCyber's webinar. Today we're going to be diving into threat exposure management, which will provide you a proactive approach to cybersecurity and hopefully provide visibility to an attack surface you may not even know exists. Just to let you know, the webinar today will be recorded and will be sent out to everyone afterwards. As a brief introduction to those of you who don't already know who we are PureCyber. We're an award-winning cybersecurity company covering all three pillars of cyber, which are the offensive, the defensive, and the governance side of things, providing you a full wraparound service, both technical and compliance-driven. Our team of experts will sit behind the scenes of all of our services, from breach monitoring, pen testing, and even a 24/7 SOC to help protect you from cyber threats. But today, you're joined with me, Thomas Evans, our Chief Offensive Security Officer, and my alter ego, Matt Jones, our Chief Defensive Security Officer, and he'll take you through some of the outlines of what we're going to cover in today's webinar.
Thank you, Tom. Hi, everyone. So in today's webinar, we'll be covering some kind of 5 key areas. One, we'll introduce you into the new threat landscape and where are the biggest threats right now, and potentially why you can't see them. We'll kind of understand what the platform for TEM will do for you in terms of identifiers and how they are monitored. We'll look at kind of 4 key elements in terms of discovery and the impact of these threats using real life examples. And then we'll move on to why and the benefits of threat exposure management, ending with a short Q&A for any questions that might arise. So first off, we'll be looking at the kind of new threat landscape and what is already going on, because I think over the last couple of months, and especially over the last month, we're in kind of unprecedented times where the amount of public and visible exposure into kind of the new attacks and the impact they're actually causing companies it's quite large right now, and we're seeing a rise in supply chain attacks. We were very aware that they were happening and people were kind of considering them, but it's now moved to where they are causing really severe impact to companies and consumers. We're seeing the targeting of actually consumer-facing brands. Quite recently, we had it where M&S and Co-op were hit, and we all saw and felt the impact of that, from potentially PII, so customer data, being exposed, to where actually you couldn't actually buy anything from the stores, or the stores had kind of really low stock at those times. Obviously, the key word right now is AI, and AI is being fed into multiple areas, from the sense of where we saw potentially for M&S, where they pretended and did a deep fake of certain employees and saw kind of fake that help desk bit, to AI being brought into the attacks from the element of kind of the EDR killers to bypassing certain elements of protection to really affect certain organizations. And where we'll be covering later on, so Tom will be doing a bit around kind of how this platform can help with misconfigurations. Those can include items like your cloud applications, all the way to maybe your firewall being misconfigured, and those being the real key areas where we see the sorts of attacks like ransomware first getting in. Threat exposure management then provides visibility into those unseen sources. That can include kind of the supply chain. So I'll be going into a piece about how this tool can be used to monitor not just your company, but others. We'll also look at the kind of unforeseen sources like shadow IT, so where some assets aren't actually controlled by the company. That could be someone's mobile phone. It could be an employee going home, logging into their personal device and using their company credentials. It could also include everything from insider threats, people being phished outside of the company network, and then people using, or threat actors using, the dark web to actually gain reconnaissance and details about the company. And you can see where this tool really comes in its own and the areas of monitoring, which we'll shortly go into. And for us, and for us as a company, the reason why we started looking at this now more than ever is, as a service, and most of you as viewers will have cybersecurity or software, security software on your endpoints, on your kind of emails. But the last kind of piece of the puzzle for us is this kind of gaining that visibility into something you're probably not aware of, like somebody going home, logging into their workplace credentials, workplace systems on their personal device, not knowing it's infected, and all that data being exposed.
Perfect. And I think, Matt, that's probably a really good place for me to jump in. I think you've covered really nicely there that the traditional threat landscape has changed. And you're right, businesses put a huge focus on, you're right, securing technologies like endpoint, servers, cloud, and email. Obviously, we've seen a huge shift in how the sort of threat actors are targeting businesses and pulling data sources from effectively data streams that a business has no knowledge or visibility of without the sort of threat exposure management solution. So I think for me, it's really a good place to start on actually, well, how do we even find this data? And I think for us, that all starts with something we refer to as identifiers. And these effectively are unique terms, words, phrases that are related to you or your business. So that could be the name of your employees. That could be obviously your company name, your email address, your web domain, or any of these in combination with each other, effectively allowing you to identify things that are out on the internet or on various different dark web forums and pull these together in terms of identifying assets, data leaks, or just things that are related to your company or your employees.
I think to add on there, Tom, really, for what you were kind of going over, it's not just kind of the assets as well that you're aware of. The tool can also understand and show you maybe some that you aren't. So as part of the solution, you would enter a domain, for example, and then what that will do behind the scenes is actually identify back to you maybe potential subdomains or IPs that are related to that domain. It could understand if they're still alive, they're contactable. Maybe you weren't aware that that site was still available from the internet, something that we're seeing more and more now where companies think certain items are sitting behind a VPN or their firewall, and unfortunately misconfiguration has allowed that to sit on the internet. These identifiers are used as pretty much keyword search terms, and what they'll be searching against is the dark web and the surface web for anything that's related to them. You can see on the slide deck here that we can use custom queries. So maybe you've got a CEO, maybe it's a VIP, and there's case studies about them on the internet, and you want to know where they are. What we can do is pull in a name of that VIP and their title or their email address and start searching for those across the internet to understand, well, if they are making case studies, are they authorized by yourselves? And if not, we can help you then understand that and take that down if necessary. What we're kind of looking at in terms of that data is certain categories of monitoring that could be looking at illicit networks. So we would be looking for credentials, we'll be looking for chat rooms. So we're able to hook in to Telegram. If you don't know what Telegram is, it's a really secure kind of chat forum, a bit like WhatsApp, but it's used a lot by kind of threat actor groups to discuss and pass certain details around their attack so far. So if your domain does pop up in a chat room, maybe it's because, number one, you've been attacked already and that data is being exposed in that chat room, or number two, they're actually going to start targeting you, and potentially we need to understand potential attack vectors quicker so we can defend against that. We'll also look at leaked credentials, lookalike domains, any emerging threats that could be. We recently had the Oracle SSO incident, which wasn't a confirmed data breach, but the platform was able to provide back to us potential companies that were affected by that, given that early kind of alert. So you can start creating plans if you were officially a part of that breach.
I think it may be worth now, Matt, going on from the theoretical to the actual and having a look at a couple of examples of things that we've actually seen taken place in terms of active exploitation. So I know we sat down the other day and pulled together some of the sort of the four top examples that we could think of where the sort of threat exposure management tools have allowed us to actively, proactively detect, and in most cases, defend against some sort of attacks that are looking to target some of our customers and organizations. So in this example, I'm going to start off by talking through a domain impersonation attack, which is where effectively a clone or a copy of your legitimate website is created. And that's obviously used to try and deceive users, get them to trust you, provide information, or in this particular example, download some malicious software. And then that will follow on to Matt giving us a bit of information around how some stealer malware and how the data that gets stolen from businesses or from individuals get published, and how we can search through some of that data, exposed data, to find things related to your business. We'll then go on to look around some S3 buckets, so looking at cloud services and common misconfigurations around how data could be inadvertently publicized and obviously then made accessible. I think finally then Matt will follow on and look at how actually we don't just have to monitor ourselves, and how we can look at our supply chain in terms of a sort of breach monitoring standpoint to make sure that we as a business stay secure by ensuring that all of our suppliers are also secure. And I think probably jumping into that domain impersonation is a good place to start. I think domain impersonation is very much a technical attack in nature. It's where somebody will take a website domain like PureCyber and look to make a clone of that, so we can convince users that we are legitimate, even though we may be illegitimate. But I think from a human perspective, actually, humans are normally really difficult and actually quite challenged with picking out abnormalities and things that look wrong. And to show that, I've got a little bit of a game to play here. We've got 5 or 6 different URLs or domains that you can see here, all here for google.com, but only some of them are true. I don't know if, whilst we're playing along, if you can spot the imposter and if you want to drop them into the chat, but we'll run through them one by one now. The first one here is actually the legitimate domain, google.com. It looks right, it feels right. In this case, it probably is right. But the second one is less so. In this case, some of you may have spotted in the center of this domain a double G's. This is what we'd refer to as a typographic attack, where we've effectively swapped one letter or number for another. Now, in this case, humans are really lazy. Traditionally, how most of us, at least in the English world, read is we look at the first letter of the word and we look at the last letter of the word and we look at the rough shape and outline of the center. And our brain effectively puts all the pieces of the puzzle together so we can understand what we're looking at. And in this case, that allows us, at least at a quick glance, to overlook common spelling mistakes within words. Attackers are even more clever, though. What they're also doing is changing letters for other alphabets. And in this example, what we've done is we've replaced the G in Google with a Cyrillic character. So if you were a non-English speaker, French, Italian, Spanish, or even some further afield languages, you'll notice that different letters and symbols will have accents. And in this case, you'll notice the G here has an accent above it, which from a technical perspective means it's a completely different domain to the true Google. And then we suppose, like I say, come back to the beginning to the legitimate. And this is just more how we read domains. So in this example, you can see actually this one is true, smtp.google.com. Now, you don't necessarily need to know what the resource is here, and you'll hopefully all be familiar with things like www.google.com. But what I'm looking at in this instance is actually how we read. So everything to do with domain names is hierarchical. And in this case, you'll see right on the right-hand side, we've got com, which originally started out as meaning company. Then we've got Google, which is obviously a subcategory of a company. And in this case, SMTP is a mail transfer service, which is a subcategory of the Google organization. So in this case, we can see this is trusted because we've read that from right to left. But if we read that from left to right, it could be that somebody's looked to manipulate or interfere effectively with one of those elements in that domain. And then last but not least, hopefully probably the most tricky one on the page, some of you are probably sitting there going, well, this looks exactly like the first one. And you'd be sort of right, but once again, we've done another typographic attack here. This typographic attack is actually swapping out the L symbol in Google for a uppercase I. And in a lot of platforms, case sensitivity is not displayed to you. So an uppercase I and a lowercase L will look normally visually similar. And that's how attackers can sometimes very quickly trick users to interface with a link or to click on a link that may not be related. And the particular example we're going to go on to show now was actually exploited in the real world approximately just over a month ago, and it targeted a service called Homebrew. Homebrew is effectively a software management tool for Apple macOS systems, which allows developers and IT staff to effectively download and install additional software packages, a bit like you would on a mobile device from like an app store. So this is a third-party app store. The threat actor in this instance decided to create a complete clone of the Homebrew website, and they paid Google for some search engine optimization. So they moved their fake website all the way up the Google search rankings right to the very top. So it was actually getting legitimate people clicking on it, looking for Homebrew. But the problem was this website wasn't trustworthy. In fact, this website was hosting some malicious software. And what I'm hoping you can see is the two sites side by side in front of you, the legitimate one on the left-hand side and the malicious one on the right. And I'm wondering if anybody wants to see if they can spot any of the differences between the two and whether or not you would be fooled by this if you happen to come across it in your day-to-day work. I'll highlight some of the abnormalities now. So you'll notice that on the legitimate Homebrew site, there's actually some sort of search functionality embedded. The attackers have decided they weren't going to copy that one across. Additionally, if you look up at the very top, and it might be a little bit small on your screens, you'll notice that the title bar for this tab actually contains some Cyrillic characters, what I previously mentioned about non-English language alphabets. And you'll notice that was tagged on right at the very end. Similarly, with the domain, you'll notice in this case, instead of the legitimate brew.sh, this was brewe.sh. And actually, there was a couple of variations of this around the attack with different domain extensions, effectively trying to perpetuate this for a longer period. But I think the biggest thing that changed on these sites was the action. In this case, the command in order to how to install Homebrew on your system. And this hopefully shows how an attacker can use a domain impersonation effectively for their own good. If we jump across to look at that in a little bit more detail, we can see here the legitimate installation command compared with the command that was hosted on that malicious website. And you'll immediately see by the color in here that there's actually quite a lot of similarity between them. They both, in fact, will download and install the Homebrew package. However, the malicious one had a couple of extra secret bits, should we say, hidden just beforehand. And in this case, it downloaded an additional package from a third-party site and actually installed it on your system. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what is this brew update that it downloaded and installed in addition? In fact, in this case, it was something called Amos, which is a piece of malware designed for macOS. And effectively, this is a macOS stealer. So it sits on your systems. It effectively installs itself as a legitimate piece of software. And then it uses that privilege and access that it's gained during its installation process to effectively steal data, whether that steals information about your system, your web browsers, your passwords, or your cookies. Takes all this data, and what you normally find behind the scenes is that some of this information is then published on the dark web or on various different Telegram channels, which I think Matt will cover off in a second. And I suppose relating this all the way back to the threat exposure management tool, and how did this all come to be? This is the sort of alert that we'd look to see. In our threat exposure management tool, the registration of the brewe.sh domain was flagged. Initially, this domain was registered and there was no content, so it would have been flagged to us as an informational risk, and lookalike domain posed no threat. But as that domain was updated, the tool will continually reevaluate the exposure. In this case, as that website started to look and feel, in terms of a similarity score, more like the existing and original domain, the criticality of this risk went up. In this case, this eventually got called a high severity risk, because effectively it was what we refer to as a lookalike site. It was looking there to deceive users. So this is how this comes into us in our threat exposure management tool. And our analysts in our security operations center can review these on a regular basis and obviously alert you as an organization if something like this occurs alongside one of your domains. But I think probably more importantly, the key bit here is we can also do a solution for this action. And we can issue things called takedown requests, which are where effectively we submit requests to the hosting providers, to the domain registrars, to effectively take this site offline to try and prevent it causing any further damage. I suppose that's probably a really good point to hand over back to Matt then, We've talked about sort of stealer malware, in this case, the AMOS platform for the Mac service, and to have a look to see how threat exposure management is able to surface some of the data that may be stolen by stealer malware.
Thank you, Tom. So yeah, stealer malware, I suppose a lot of people don't know what it is, and it's not a new piece of kit and piece of kind of software, but something that's being used now more and more just because of the access it really gives back to the threat actors and the data, the recon that it allows them to understand about the machine. It is huge. So Tom's covered a little bit around what is info stealer malware, but just think of it as a keylogger. It sits on, instead of kind of tracking what you're typing onto the keyboard, what it's doing is recording absolutely everything you do. So what files you interact with, it'll take a copy of those. If you go on any browser, visit any websites, it'll understand what website you're going to and what credentials you place into that. If you do log into anything, you'll usually have something called a session cookie. It will take a copy of that and then export it back into the malware. It will understand and retrieve your autofill data from the browser, your saved passwords from the browser, and it will look at other key items to understand what specifications are your machine, what AV and software is installed. And all of that then is pretty much bundled back up and sold or just placed on the dark web for malicious intent. And you wouldn't even know it's happened. This is the main reason why it's so scary without kind of TEM running, and unless your kind of AV and EDR picks up these pieces of malware and software, then there is no visibility into this. So we're just going to show an example of how this looks in the platform. So this is a user. So we're able to understand kind of from this malware, if we were the threat actor, when this was executed, the username of the machine, where we can see what kind of malware was actually executed. We have the spec, so we can see it's a Windows 10 Enterprise, so maybe it's their actual work machine. We can see the IP address, so that IP address is based in France, and we can use that to target the user better. We can see what AV and software, AV and security software. We can see the files, so we're able to pick up, this malware was able to see, okay, there's a file called secrets and to do, so we can use those to actually further the attack. And you can also see it picked up autofill data and passwords and processes from that machine. We have 34 pages of credentials, so each time a user went to a website, it recorded that, and you can also see they're pretty much using the same password constantly back and forth, so we can see a lot of password reuse. And finally, we can actually see a copy of all the cookies that were extracted. So these then can be used to bypass certain elements of protection, like MFA, because this will just give you a straight authentication into that system. And the only way around that is making sure those sessions are expiring constantly. Tom, there you go. So these are the kind of 4 areas I wanted to drill into a little bit more. So you've just sort of counted detail. So on that example, these are some of the more worrying, I suppose, leaks that were identified. One being kind of their main website and email provider. So having access into that will allow us to see, okay, here's their emails, what are they using? We can see who they're contacting and maybe use that email to actually further our attacks to even more companies. And we can also see potential development systems or where they're hosting potential custom applications, which could further on the attack and also allow me to log in as them on those and cause severe disruption if they are hosted live. The malware was also able to extract files from the machine. Now, why this is really important is, number one, you'll be shocked, or maybe not, that users still store passwords in files on their machine. So that secrets.zip could be all their passwords for every single application. So if it wasn't already exposed, we now have a copy of those. Those files could also include PII. And if they do include people's date of births, names, addresses, maybe bank details, then that is a GDPR kind of incident, and that would have to be raised to the ICO. The session cookies, so we were able to see the kind of and extract all the session cookies that were live. Again, that would allow us to bypass protection mechanisms like MFA and also stuff like alerts where if a user logs in from a different IP address, it usually informs the user of that. Because we're using our session cookie, it won't have that same kind of alert. And finally, we're able to see the specifications of that device. And why this is important is that we get to know exactly from an attacker point of view, where you're coming from, what OS you actually have, and what security software is installed. So if we want to go, right, okay, let's see if there's any vulnerabilities against Kaspersky or Windows Defender right now, we'll have that as a first kind of step into your device and company. Or we could use Kaspersky as a phishing element and maybe try and get the user to install a brand new version of that, but it being malicious.
I think, Matt, it's a really, really good talking point, because I think the bit you mentioned on there around profiling the host is quite interesting, in the fact that you said this device is likely a business device because it was running Windows 10 Enterprise. I'm just thinking back to an example of this exact sort of attack that we witnessed a couple of months ago, where actually it wasn't so much a business device that was compromised with Stealer malware. It was a user's own home personal device, but that user had also taken things like their work usernames and passwords home and attempted to log into emails and GitHub and other work services from an unmanaged device. And that was enough for us to pick up that their work credentials had been leaked as part of this Stealer malware breach. That's perfect. No, thank you for that, Matt. I think moving on then, the other thing we can think about is things that leak from misconfiguration. So these are things normally directly related to your business. And I think one of the good examples that I want to touch on here is around Amazon S3 buckets, or probably more generally online cloud storage. Over the last few years, we've seen a huge trend of businesses moving from on-premise solutions of having infrastructure and technology on site to using cloud hosted platforms. And this particular example, we're going to look at S3 buckets or storage buckets, which effectively are a file system in the cloud where you're able to upload files and folders, share data. In this particular example, though, PureCyber created an S3 bucket, and we may have accidentally left it with some insecure settings. This is where any of those files that are in the buckets are publicly accessible. So as long as a user knew the URL or effectively the link to access one of those files, they could do so. This is a very common misconfiguration. And in fact, there are automated bots, there are attackers, and there are security researchers constantly searching around the internet to look for effectively open buckets that contain data that they could then use for further exploitation steps. And actually looking back at the tail end of 2024, there was a really big one that hit the news where some major sporting team, in this case Aston Villa, were impacted by this exact attack. Aston Villa had subcontracted effectively a membership platform out to a third party who, during the migration of data from one system to another, had used an Amazon S3 bucket as a way of storing and effectively backing up the membership data as part of that transfer process. Unfortunately, that bucket hadn't been adequately secured, and that resulted in around 140,000 Aston Villa member records being publicly exposed. So that included a load of PII in terms of first names, date of births, addresses, telephone numbers, and even information about their membership. So obviously thinking about how this could be used, or more importantly, how this could impact you if this was your customer data. I think reflecting this once again back to the sort of threat exposure management side of things and how this would be detected, this could be detected in a couple of different ways. Obviously, if you were Aston Villa and you had signed up to our threat exposure management tool, the hope would be that the TEM system would also be doing the searching for these open and publicly accessible S3 buckets. And we detect this in the sense of there's a load of data out there related to Aston Villa Football Club, but also from your perspective as an individual or as a customer of Aston Villa, you could also use the threat exposure management tool to monitor yourselves. And if you were to appear, even just as a single line in this data breach, then obviously you could be notified as that as well. So there's a couple of different perspectives to look from in terms of how threat exposure management would be able to detect and hopefully prevent the impact of a data breach. The one thing we can't do in this particular instance is stop this exposure. The only thing we can do is obviously inform the companies, whether that be Aston Villa or their suppliers and third parties, about this exposure and get them to change those configuration settings. to effectively prevent public access in the future. And I think probably moving on then from there, thinking about how this S3 bucket in this particular example wasn't related specifically to Aston Villa, but was a resultant of an insecure supply chain. I think, Matt, it may be worth us just quickly touching on how we can use the TEM platform to not only monitor your own business, but also to monitor your suppliers to make sure that you're aware first and foremost of if they get breached and if they pose a risk to you as a business.
Yeah, so suppliers are probably one of your biggest maybe vectors in, right? They hold a lot of data into you. They could have a lot of access into your organization. We see a lot of companies who allow their suppliers into their actual network to carry out work. Do you understand if they got ransomware or attacked, what is that impact on you? A recent stat said that 70% of kind of organizations actually don't have any visibility in the suppliers, and sometimes haven't really audited those before they actually went with their services. Quite recently, Sainsbury's, Aldi were recently affected straight after the M&S attack, and that was Peter Greenchild. So what that happened there, they got ransomware. That obviously then affected their logistics and deliveries into those supermarkets, affecting how they actually, number one, the stock on their shelves, and number two, the impact of all that food waste. And that was pretty much a limited, kind of a small in terms of attacks that we've seen on other companies, but we're just going to see a constant rise in that all the time. And how kind of TEM will help with discovery of that is that you can place your suppliers into this platform. So you can put in every single supplier that you have as a domain, and we will monitor for any ransomware exposures for those companies and give you that quick alert of company A has been ransomware. And this is how it will look. You'll understand and see in our dashboard view, and also down at an actual log level. You'll be able to see what date and time they were actually placed on the dark web. So to give you a bit of information on how this works, usually you get ransomware, and then the company gets placed onto the company's or threat actors' dark web blog site, and it will usually include stuff like who the company was hit, a bit of a description, and maybe some evidence of what they kind of stole. And you can kind of see that in that content preview pane on that right screenshot, where they were showing images and actually links back to where you can actually download that data. If we just go to the next slide for me, Tom, thank you. If the breach also included files and they were leaked as part of it, then we'll be able to have visibility and take copies of that. So we're able to help you to understand the risks of that data being exposed and how it looks. If possible, we can actually take a download of that file and give it back to you so you know exactly what information was taken, so then you can carry out your own internal processes around this. And finally, just around kind of why threat exposure management really does matter. And we've covered some of the benefits already, but it's one of probably the tools that will only give you the access and visibility into these locations that maybe you can't have or see right now, or were even aware they existed. Right now, can you browse the dark web of where you are? Can you see those certain Telegram chats? And if anyone starts talking about you, do you have visibility into them? And do you know what to do with it if you did? And can you right now see what potential kind of similar domains are available for you, and are they about to phish you? This is what the tool, hopefully, and the service combined will actually help you kind of discover. Everything on the platform is automated, and what we mean by that is as soon as you enter your identifiers from a domain to a name to an IP address, it will search the dark web and clear web and categorize it exactly for you and really show you what you need to see. We also provide that as a managed service, so our analysts will understand that data and let you exactly know what's going on. Instead of you looking through the data, you can rely on our knowledge and expertise in this area. Everything that we do in the platform as well is triaged. So if it is potentially a leaked domain, a leaked credential, a stealer malware, we'll understand the risks to you as a business, give that back, and help you isolate and understand that risk. And if it's a domain that's similar to you, we can help with that takedown and make sure it's removed moving forward. And overall, it is low cost. It's £20 a month, but if you stay on for after the Q&A, we do have a bundle price just for this webinar.
And I suppose that's probably a good place to say if anybody's got any questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll try and run through and answer a couple of them. So I can see already there's a really good question out there around how this threat exposure management tool integrates with other security tools that you may already use within businesses, such as SOAR tools and IDM platforms, to effectively automate the responsiveness to this. I don't know if you want to just run us through some of the capabilities on how we can integrate in, and also sometimes the negatives around integrating and why that sort of human touch may be worthwhile in that process.
Yeah, so TEM can go into different platforms, whether that is a SOAR, it can go into help desk systems and multiple others. We've seen it go into SIEMs as well to help with that kind of monitoring aspect. And for that question, we can provide a list of kind of exhaustive integrations, so we don't have to go through them on this kind of webinar, but it does integrate. And I suppose the automated element of it is great, right? We want to make sure those, if it is a credential, that is kind of closed down and isolated as quick as possible. On other elements where it is an impersonated domain or it is kind of a stealer malware, that kind of human element will be required to really move that forward, because it's understanding the context behind that. What does that user have access to? You know, what is their role in the organization? Are they classed as a VIP? And when we talk about VIPs, not just kind of the CEO or directors, it could be the IT manager who has admin access to absolutely everything. So it's having that kind of context, and that's why we just don't give you the platform. It's all kind of managed in the element of there's a human looking after it to really guide you as best as possible.
That's great. I think we've had a couple of other questions come in as well. But obviously, if you've got any other questions that you can think of that people want to answer, let us know. The other question, Matt, that I've got in front of me is around how we monitor data that's captured on personal devices. Thinking back to that sort of stealer malware example we mentioned earlier on. How does the TEM platform allow sort of for data monitoring from personal devices?
Yeah, it's a really common kind of question that we get, right? You know, we're not placing any piece of software on those devices. How do we see that? And it's all around those identifiers. At the end of the day, is keyword searching. So if the employee goes onto that personal device and as soon as they use a similar identifier, so it could be as soon as they enter credentials into Microsoft 365 and their email address is matt@companyaa.com. If we're monitoring company A, that is a trigger for it, and an alert will be raised if that comes up in kind of stealer malware, as an example.
Awesome. I think we've got one other question then, Matt, I've just seen pop in at the right moment in time around actually the takedown function. So we've got an impersonated domain that's detected in the platform. Sort of how does that takedown process work, and is it effective? Do the providers and publishers listen?
Yes, this is my favorite question, I suppose, and it really all depends on where the site is hosted and where it's registered. Really, we have something called bulletproof hosting, where some providers will host in data centers that don't actually listen to certain elements of takedowns, and if that is the case, we will try different vectors to bring that domain down. But most of the times they do listen. The recent example, we took down a domain within a week, and it all really depends on, again, who is hosting it, where it is, and whether or not the threat actor who is hosting that site, if it is malicious, actually tries to defend what they're doing. And it's quite rare, but we have seen attackers where they go, well, look, I'm actually doing something that's fine. I'm not doing anything malicious, I promise. And then we have to go through that process. But all I can say on that is we guide you and we help you along the full guide and road to that takedown to make sure it is executed, hopefully successfully.
Perfect. It's always a constant battle, isn't it? The attackers are always getting better, and then the defenders are getting better as well. And it's never a solution where we've got a perfect harmony. We're always battling against each other, and some things work and some don't. I think we've had a reasonably good success rate so far in takedowns that we've had to issue. And we've got one more question, and it's just come in, Matt, which probably will be the last one for our webinar. And it's around what is the difference between threat exposure management and hunters?
Now, I don't know what is meant by hunters in that question. Happy to have context, or kind of the person who asked that, happy to have a conversation offline so we can go into that in a bit more detail.
Awesome. No, I think unless we get any further context on that question, I suppose I'll start by trying to wrap up for the day. But obviously, thank you everybody firstly for coming and sort of watching and engaging with this webinar. Hopefully you found it useful to understand a little bit more around the sort of threat exposure management platform, and hopefully how it provides a sort of a bit more visibility in those areas that you wouldn't normally get access to. Obviously, as Matt mentioned earlier, the TEM identifiers are generally quite low cost, but obviously we've got a bit of a webinar exclusive today where we've bundled 5 identifiers into a bundle for just £95. So obviously, if you guys are interested in taking advantage of that offer, or generally finding out more about our threat exposure management service, or in regard to any other PureCyber service, obviously there's going to be some links in the chat. Feel free to reach out, and you'll get contacted back by one of our cyber specialists to sort of get you set up with threat exposure management. And say if anybody had to drop off halfway through the call, obviously the webinar has been recorded. So what we'll do is we'll get that link shared out to everybody who attended. And generally, I hope you found it useful and sort of welcome any further questions. Apart from that, we'll see you at our next webinar in July.